If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more epic HFY tales every day. Don't miss out on the next adventure. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're always the first to know when a new story drops. Liking this video helps us bring you more incredible stories, so smash that like button if you're ready for more. What would you do if you were in this situation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Which part of this story surprised you the most? Share your reactions in the comments. I love reading what you think. If you could add one twist to this story, what would it be? Let's get creative in the comments. What do you think happens next in the human versus alien saga? Let's discuss your theories below. John Harris blinked rapidly, the glaring white light of the sterile room making it difficult to see at first. His muscles were stiff, his head pounding from whatever drug they had used to knock him out. Disoriented, he struggled to sit up. The cold metal of the table beneath him pressed against his skin, and as his vision cleared, he could finally make out his surroundings. The room was sparse, minimalist, and intimidating. Every surface was gleaming, featureless, and smooth, with a faint hum from machines he couldn't recognize. This wasn't Earth. The strange symbols flashing on the far wall confirmed it. He was aboard an alien ship, that much was certain. His mission had gone horribly wrong. What had started as a routine survey had ended with him captured by whoever these aliens were. His heart pounded in his chest as fear gnawed at his insides. But panic wouldn't help. John forced himself to take deep breaths, steadying his mind. He had to understand the situation first. Panic could come later. The doors slid open with a faint hiss, and they entered. There were 4 of them, tall, slender beings with pale, nearly translucent skin. Their eyes were cold, jet-black orbs, completely devoid of emotion. They moved with a fluid grace, their long fingers tapping at the floating screens that trailed beside them. These must be the Zorith, the species he had heard whispers of in the interstellar community. Superior in technology, ruthless in their pursuits. They didn't see him as a threat, that much was clear from the way they ignored him, as if he were nothing more than a science experiment. They spoke in a clipped, melodic language John couldn't understand, but their body language said enough. There was no fear in their movements, no caution. They had captured a human, and to them, that was little more than capturing an insect. John listened carefully, watching how they interacted with their technology, noting every detail. They barely glanced at him, tapping and swiping on their holographic consoles. His mind raced. He had to learn. The ship, the tech, their protocols. He didn't have much time. One of the Zorith, the tallest among them, stepped forward. His pale hands moved over a control panel, and John felt a sudden, sharp pain in his neck. He winced, his body recoiling as something metallic clicked into place against his skin. Some kind of tracking or restraining device, he assumed. The Zorith scientist didn't so much as blink. It was routine for them. He was nothing. The aliens walked away as easily as they had entered, leaving John alone in the sterile room. His mind, though still clouded with fear, had sharpened with the realization these creatures weren't taking him seriously. They didn't see him as a threat, just as a lower being to be studied. That could work to his advantage. John scanned the room again, this time more deliberately. The walls were seamless, the machines unfamiliar, but he knew he could figure them out. He had to. The Zorith's arrogance was already glaring. They had confined him, drugged him, sure. But they hadn't restrained him beyond the device on his neck. They were so confident in their security, in their tech, that they didn't even think about a physical struggle. That's where they were wrong. He slid off the table, his bare feet touching the cold floor. He could feel the subtle vibrations through the metal. They were moving. This was a ship, probably an enormous one. His heart raced again, but not with fear this time. His mind was clearing, sharpening, and every second was an opportunity to learn something. The Zorith might have the technology, but they didn't have instinct, adaptability. And that's where humans always had the advantage. John moved cautiously, pacing the perimeter of the room, feeling for seams, hidden controls, anything. He wasn't an engineer, but he knew enough about systems to figure out what he could use. He paused by the wall where the alien symbols flashed. Patterns, everything operated on patterns. He just had to learn theirs. It was in that moment that the door slid open again. This time, a single Zorath entered, clad in a slightly more ornate robe. This one carried authority. John's jaw tightened as the Zorath approached without fear. It was the first time John had seen one of them up close, really looked at them. Tall, slender, their faces emotionless. The alien looked down at him, and John could feel the cold dismissal in his gaze. "Commander Zeker," John muttered to himself, watching the alien move. The Zorath commander didn't speak. Instead, he adjusted a floating control panel with delicate precision. No rush, no concern. John was just another test subject in a long list of experiments. The Zorath's overconfidence was palpable. They didn't even bother to communicate with him, as if his thoughts, his actions, were irrelevant. Zeker's black eyes briefly flicked over him before returning to the panel, adjusting the settings on whatever device had been planted on John's neck. John could feel the slight hum from it now, but there was no pain. It was a tracker, probably more, a control mechanism. He was sure of that now. And yet Zeker turned his back to him. They didn't see him as a threat. John's mind was already working on an idea. He might be vastly outgunned here, out of his depth technologically, but human ingenuity thrived in chaos. He had learned from countless moments like this that the key to survival was never brute force, but observation. The Zorath were arrogant, that much was clear. They believed in their technology more than in their ability to anticipate what he could do. As Zeker exited the room, John's hand subtly reached to the device on his neck. He could feel the slight warmth, the hum of energy pulsing through it. He couldn't remove it, not yet. But maybe he didn't need to. He had other ideas. He returned to the cold, metallic table and sat. From the corner of his eye, he watched as the door slid shut again, leaving him alone in the room. His mind was working furiously. The Zorath had no idea what kind of mistakes they were making. He could feel it now, the disconnect in their approach. They relied so heavily on their technology, on their advanced systems, that they missed the subtleties, the human ability to adapt, to exploit even the smallest weaknesses. The Zorath were about to learn that the hard way. John's breathing slowed as his mind sharpened, focusing on every detail he had picked up so far. The cold, logical minds of the Zorath hadn't anticipated this. They wouldn't expect him to analyze their systems, wouldn't expect him to escape. But that's exactly what he was going to do. John sat quietly, absorbing every bit of information he could from the constant movements and hums around him. The Zorath, for all their supposed superiority, were predictable. Too predictable. Every few minutes, a thin, pale guard would pass by the entrance of his containment area. Their patrols were almost mechanical, like clockwork. The technology that guarded him, the cameras, sensors, the automated security, all functioned perfectly. But it was all too rigid. Too controlled. They relied entirely on their tech. John could see it in the way they moved, in how they acted. Every step, every action was calculated, like a machine running through a program. And that was their weakness. Technology was only as good as the mind behind it. And their minds weren't thinking outside their programming. Not in the way John could. He began to mentally map the area, watching how the doors slid open and closed, how the guards interacted with the systems. His containment field, a shimmering energy barrier, didn't seem to falter once, and John had no doubt it was state-of-the-art. Still, everything had a flaw. The trick was finding it. Each time the Zorath guards walked by, John shifted slightly, testing the boundaries of his containment. He kept it subtle, almost unnoticeable, but enough to see how they'd react. The sensors would blink faintly, recalibrating, but the guards never did more than glance. To them, he was a non-threat. He'd let them keep thinking that. The next time a guard passed, John deliberately fumbled with a small device he had been handed earlier, something the Zorath had used to feed him information or monitor his vitals. He wasn't entirely sure which. He pressed the wrong button, deliberately, causing the lights to flicker briefly. He pretended to be confused, feigning ignorance, and waited for the reaction. The guard stopped, looked, and then quickly dismissed it as human incompetence. That was it. They weren't paying attention to him, not in the way they should be. They didn't expect anything more than basic resistance, and that, John realized, gave him the perfect cover to plan his escape. Over the next few hours, John began pushing the limits in small, calculated ways. He moved equipment, adjusted settings on nearby consoles, always careful to make it look like an accident or ignorance. Each time, he studied their responses. They were quick to fix the issues, but slow to see the bigger picture. The Zorith treated him like a child playing with technology far beyond his understanding. They had no idea he was learning everything he needed from their dismissive reactions. John had noticed something else too: patterns. The guards followed strict routes, and the shifts in the energy barriers around him were timed to the millisecond. Their over-reliance on precision was becoming clearer to him. It wasn't a flaw in the tech itself, it was the way they used it, assuming nothing could go wrong. That was their downfall. He started pushing them mentally. His actions became bolder but were still calculated, meant to probe their responses. He would speak to them in broken, stumbling sentences, asking questions that didn't matter. He noticed how they responded. They didn't care to engage, or if they did, their responses were clipped and without emotion. The Zoritha's logical minds were incapable of handling unpredictability. They processed everything through patterns, routines, and rational behavior. John wasn't following their patterns, and that made him invisible in a way they didn't even realize. Then came the preparation. It started with small things. A thin strip of metal from a discarded panel. A broken piece of the communication device he'd fumbled with earlier. The Zoritha's security was immaculate, but they didn't think like humans. They didn't see everyday objects as potential tools or threats. John had grown up improvising, adapting, and now, in the sterile environment of their ship, those same instincts were coming back to him. The scraps were nothing on their own, but in his hands they were tools. He hid the pieces carefully, out of sight from the ever-watching cameras. The Zoritha's attention was elsewhere, focused on their own systems. John could almost hear the clock ticking in his mind. Time was running short. Commander Zeker had made more visits than usual. He could sense the growing suspicion in the alien's dark eyes. Zeker didn't trust that things were going smoothly, even if he hadn't yet identified John as the source of the disruption. John knew what was coming. They were preparing to move him. The signs were all there: the increased security presence, the subtle changes in guard rotations. He wasn't sure where they intended to take him, but he couldn't afford to find out. The only way out was now, before they locked him down in a way even he couldn't figure out. The pressure was building. He could feel it in the way the guards had started glancing his way more often, in the way the facility seemed to tighten around him. The Zorith might have underestimated him, but they were still methodical, cautious in their own cold way. Zeker was no fool. The transfer was inevitable. John had maybe hours, or less, to execute his plan. His makeshift tools were ready, crude but effective. He had hidden a thin metal strip along the seams of his clothing, a shard that could interrupt the field's power for just a second, hopefully long enough. The communication device's remains were repurposed to overload a nearby console, causing a distraction when he needed it most. Everything was set. The tension grew thicker with every passing minute. John's mind was racing, but outwardly, he remained calm, passive, as he had for days. Zeker's arrogance was both a curse and a blessing. It had allowed John time to prepare, but now, as the clock ticked down, that same arrogance made Zeker more dangerous. He wasn't quite sure, but something was amiss in the commander's mind, and it wouldn't be long before the alien acted. John's heart pounded in his chest, not out of fear, but from the anticipation. His mind had already shifted into action mode. Every detail was locked in. The guard's timing. The system's patterns. The vulnerabilities he'd uncovered. All of it was leading to this moment. Zeker had returned, his tall frame looming in the doorway. His cold, calculating gaze fell on John, scanning him like a machine evaluating data. There was no emotion in Zeker's eyes, but there was a sense of inevitability. John had no doubt that Zeker was about to initiate the transfer. Time was up. John had learned enough. His escape plan was in motion, and in the moments that followed, the Zorith would finally realize their mistake. They'd underestimated him from the beginning, but it was far too late for them now. John waited until the last possible moment, nerves tightly coiled but mind sharp. The room was quiet, the hum of the containment field steady. He knew the patterns now, understood the subtle rhythm of the ship's systems. His hand shifted to the thin piece of metal hidden in his sleeve, waiting for the right beat, the precise timing to exploit the weakness he'd found. The guards passed by. He slipped the metal into the control panel, just where the energy barrier flickered for a fraction of a second every cycle. It was an invisible gap, one they hadn't noticed. The current sputtered, breaking just long enough for him to push through. The movement was smooth, and for a moment, everything seemed to hold its breath. Then he was out, the barrier snapping back into place behind him, as if nothing had happened. His heart raced, but he forced himself to move slowly. Too fast, and they noticed something was off. He moved in the shadows, just as the guards turned the corner. His fingers traced the path he'd memorized. He knew their patrols by heart now. They followed the same routes, at the same times, every time. He slipped past their gaze, feeling the weight of each second ticking by. He reached a service hatch he'd identified days ago, his makeshift tool fitting into the slot he'd studied. The hatch slid open quietly. Inside was the network of cables and connections that powered the containment fields. He had no way of fully shutting them down, not without triggering alarms, but he didn't need to. He just needed to cause enough disruption to confuse them. Enough chaos to cover his tracks. He severed a key line with the shard of metal, and immediately, the ship groaned as systems struggled to reroute power. The lights flickered. He heard the hum of machinery glitch. Security systems stuttered. He didn't have long. They'd realize something was wrong soon. John ducked back into the corridor, blending into the shadows as he moved toward the main control room. He knew Commander Zeker would be there. He had no choice but to confront him now. Zeker was too methodical to ignore the system errors, too focused on maintaining control. John counted on that. The alien didn't expect him to act this quickly. He slipped past another patrol, adrenaline keeping his steps silent. The control room doors loomed ahead, guarded by two more Zorith, their expressions as emotionless as ever. He reached into his sleeve, pulling out the small device he'd rigged from scraps of their tech. It wouldn't take them down, but it would do enough to buy him the seconds he needed. He activated it, sending a surge through the systems near the door. The guards faltered, their attention snapping to the flashing control panels as lights blinked wildly. In that moment of distraction, John moved, slipping past them into the control room. The door closed behind him with a soft hiss. Zeker stood at the center of the room, his back to John, focused on the cascading system alerts. His fingers tapped rapidly across the glowing console, trying to restore order. He hadn't even noticed John's presence yet. John took a slow breath. He stepped forward. Zeker's head turned, his dark, cold eyes locking onto John. There was no fear in them, only a brief flicker of surprise, quickly masked by disdain. "You," the alien said, his voice as devoid of emotion as ever. "You think you can escape?" John didn't answer. He didn't need to. He could see the confidence in Zeker's posture, the arrogance that had been there since the beginning. But this time, John was ready. He'd already won half the battle. He had the element of surprise. Zeker moved to activate the ship's defenses, but John had anticipated it. He lunged toward the console, knocking the alien's hand away, and with one quick motion, he jabbed a fragment of metal into the interface, disrupting the controls. Zeker's calm facade cracked. He hadn't expected this. John could see the calculation in the alien's eyes, the way he was trying to process this new variable. Zeker relied on his technology, on the systems that John had already disrupted. John wasn't supposed to be able to think this fast, to react this unpredictably. Seeker reached for a weapon at his side, but John was faster. He wasn't stronger, but he was quicker, more desperate. He twisted the device out of Seeker's grasp and threw it aside. The commander's frustration grew, but John could see he was already losing control. John smashed the console with a single, forceful blow, sending sparks flying as the lights dimmed again. The ship groaned, systems glitching wildly now. Alarms began to blare. Seeker's gaze shifted from John to the collapsing control panel. For the first time, there was something almost like fear in the alien's eyes. His world, his perfect system, was breaking down. John didn't wait for the next move. He sprinted out of the control room as chaos erupted around him. The alarms echoed through the corridors, lights flickering, guards rushing past in confusion. They weren't prepared for this. John had caused just enough havoc to slip through the cracks. He moved quickly, ducking behind walls as the Zorith tried to restore order. They were too logical, too rigid in their responses. They couldn't adapt to the mess he had created. They didn't understand how to think on their feet. John's unpredictability was his greatest weapon. He rounded a corner, nearly crashing into a pair of guards. For a split second, their black eyes locked onto him, but he didn't hesitate. He tossed the last of his makeshift devices, a small flash grenade he'd crafted from their own tech, blinding them just long enough for him to slip past. Every second mattered now. The ship's corridors twisted and turned, but John had memorized his path. He reached the final junction, the hatch leading to an escape pod. The door was sealed, but he had anticipated that too. He slid the metal shard into the lock's control panel, bypassing the security systems. The door slid open with a heavy groan, revealing the escape pod inside. He could hear footsteps behind him, the Zorith closing in. They had finally realized what he was doing. It didn't matter. He was already halfway through the hatch, sealing the pod shut behind him as the ship's systems struggled to respond. Zorith voices echoed down the corridor, their footsteps growing louder, but they were too late. John's fingers flew over the pod's controls. He didn't need to understand their language anymore. He had learned enough. The pod jerked violently as it detached from the ship, the stars spinning around him as the craft shot into the blackness of space. He took a breath, watching the alien ship grow smaller in the distance, alarms still blaring inside. They'd never expected him to escape. They'd underestimated him from the beginning. Now they were paying the price. John stared at the stars outside the pod, his mind already racing with what came next. He wasn't out of danger yet. But for now he'd won. And the Zorith, for all their technology, had learned the hard way what it meant to underestimate a human. The Zorith ship was in disarray, the once pristine halls now pulsing with red emergency lights. Alarms blared through the corridors, and the normally composed Zorith crew moved with a frantic energy. Commander Zeker stood in the control room, staring at the failing systems, disbelief washing over him. His hands twitched as he moved from one malfunctioning console to another, trying to make sense of what had happened. One human. Just one had managed to infiltrate and dismantle their ship's most secure systems. Zeker's mind raced, trying to compute how a species so inferior in technology could have outmaneuvered them. He had been meticulous, overseeing every detail of the human's capture, ensuring that every protocol had been followed. Yet somehow, the human had slipped through his fingers, exploiting flaws Zeker hadn't even considered. How had he missed it? How had they all missed it? The crew murmured in confusion, their black eyes flickering with uncertainty for the first time. The escape pod was long gone, leaving nothing but a trail of chaos in its wake. The ship's AI struggled to regain control, but John's disruptions had run deeper than the Zorith anticipated. Their dependence on automated systems was now their greatest weakness, a vulnerability the human had turned against them. Zeker clenched his fists, his cold logic failing him in the face of this catastrophe. They had underestimated the human, seen him as a primitive, insignificant species. That assumption had cost them dearly. The other officers approached Zeker for orders, but the commander remained silent, staring at the empty space where the human had once been held. Meanwhile, far from the ship, John floated in the escape pod, drifting through space. He wasn't safe yet, but the Zorath were no longer his immediate concern. His fingers worked quickly over the controls, tapping into the systems he had studied during his time in captivity. Every moment on their ship, every observation he made, had led him to this point. He had learned their weaknesses, understood their overconfidence, and now he was about to strike back. He tapped into the communication systems, sending out a coded transmission. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The message was brief, containing the vital intelligence humanity needed to turn the tide against the Zorath, the locations of key outposts, the vulnerabilities in their ships, the blind spots in their systems. It wasn't just a personal victory anymore. John's escape was about to ripple across the galaxy. Back on the Zorath ship, Seeker's frustration grew as he realized the full extent of John's actions. The sabotage was more extensive than anticipated. John hadn't just escaped, he had infected their systems, planted seeds of chaos that were now spreading throughout their network. The ship's defenses were compromised, communication lines failing, leaving the Zorath scrambling. For all their advanced technology, their rigid reliance on it had left them vulnerable to someone who could think outside the box. The higher command would demand answers. How had a single human managed to dismantle the security of one of their most advanced vessels? Seeker knew the consequences would be severe, but more than that, he was beginning to understand that their entire approach to the human race had been flawed. They had seen humans as primitive, emotionally driven creatures, too chaotic and irrational to pose any real threat. Now, that very chaos was threatening to unravel the Zorath's carefully constructed empire. As the days passed, word of John's escape spread. Other Zorath ships faced similar disruptions, as John's intelligence gave humanity the upper hand. They weren't engaging in large-scale battles. Instead, they were targeting the Zorath's systems, exploiting the same weaknesses John had uncovered. One by one, the Zorath's hold on key territories weakened. Their overconfidence, their belief in their superiority, had blinded them to the simple truth: humans adapted, humans learned, and humans fought back in ways the Zorath had never anticipated. John's actions had sent shockwaves through the galaxy. What the Zorath couldn't comprehend was that it wasn't about brute force or advanced weaponry. It was about resilience, creativity, and the ability to improvise. The Zorath had built their empire on logic, on flawless execution of calculated plans. But they hadn't accounted for a species that thrived on unpredictability. As more and more Zorath systems fell into disarray, the alien race found itself in a position it had never considered. Their control, once absolute, was slipping. They couldn't adjust fast enough. Their rigid minds, incapable of thinking beyond their technological frameworks, couldn't cope with the rapid changes happening around them. Humanity, with its seemingly endless capacity to adapt, was winning. John's escape became the catalyst for something far greater. His ingenuity had exposed the Zorath's greatest flaw, their inability to understand the human spirit. They had viewed emotions as weaknesses, unpredictability as chaos. But those very traits had given John the edge he needed to dismantle their security, to disrupt their empire. Humanity didn't need to overpower the Zorath with sheer numbers or superior technology. They just needed to exploit the cracks, the weaknesses that had always been there, hidden beneath the layers of arrogance and logic. The Zorath, for all their advancements, had never faced an enemy like this before. They had never faced a species so resilient, so determined to survive. As the Zorath Empire began to crumble, Seeker could only watch in disbelief. Everything he had built, everything his people had relied on, was falling apart, not from an alien armada, but from the actions of one human. A human they had dismissed as insignificant. In the aftermath, humanity's message was clear: never underestimate them again. The Zorath had learned that lesson too late, their empire left in ruins by the very species they had considered beneath them. John's escape was more than just a victory for him. It was a testament to the strength of the human race. A race that had been pushed to the brink, but had come back stronger, smarter, and more adaptable than anyone could have imagined. The Zorath's downfall was complete, not because of war, but because of their arrogance. They had underestimated a single human, and in doing so, had sealed their own fate. Humanity, for all its flaws, had proven that no matter the odds, it could outthink, outlast, and outfight even the most advanced enemies. And in the vast expanse of the galaxy, the name John Harris would forever be remembered as the man who showed the universe what humans were truly capable of.